Our communities are over-policed.
We have to address the elephant in the room, the racists.
Well, we want to expand white privilege and deepen it.
Just some of the characters I've met over the last couple of years reporting on race in America. Here, 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 and here. The question I always ask of people on these stories is, how can things get better in terms of race in this country? The answers I get, well, they're pretty varied.
You want to respect the fact that we're a citizen in this city, and you want to give us the equal rights that you have when you go home to your children.
I say, you know what? Maybe you should stop committing crimes, and maybe when a police officer does tell you to stop and put your hands on the steering wheel, obey your law enforcement officer.
More from them later, but what I'm looking for is a single concrete step that America could take to make things better. Well, that sounds difficult, but we are going to come up with some ideas. Let me start, though, by showing you a little of a story we've just been covering in New Orleans.
Oh, we're going to defend it. Turn around! Turn around!
It was a battle over monuments, which the council's now torn down because they celebrated white supremacy or slavery.
And I say destroy them. Throw them in the bottom of the Mississippi River.
It's just the latest illustration of how people just can't see eye to eye on issues of race.
It's the cultural memory of the city, of which everybody owns from generations. So if you destroy that, you're destroying the cultural memory.
Well, as I've traveled this country, it seemed obvious to me how divisive issues of race are in all kinds of ways. But I'm often told the problem is, well, people like me talking about race, and that actually there are no disadvantages now in America because of the color of someone's skin.
I don't believe someone is favored legally because of their race. If anything, it may work in a reverse sense because of affirmative action that I think's brought a lot of bitterness when people don't get jobs because of their race.
And there's been a black president, right? So how can there be a problem? That's what's often said to me. So before we look at solutions, we're going to have to spend a few moments looking at evidence that there's a problem at all. Some things seem pretty obvious, like the shocking statistic that 1 in 3 black men in America will spend some time in prison, or the fact that on average, black people serve longer sentences than white people for the same crimes. One case really opened my eyes, that of Robert Jones, who was in prison for 23 years for a murder we discovered he didn't commit. What was astonishing to me was the judge who put him away admitted that at the time, courts were looking for any excuse to incarcerate young black men. Listen to this.
The way we look at the Robert Joneses, if not today, previous to the day, but if he didn't do this, he did something else.
And this is the bit.
And he therefore got away with doing something else or some things else, and therefore his punishment is not justified for this particular act, it's justified for other things that got away.
So what he's talking about there is black people clearly being treated unfairly by the criminal justice system. And of course, there are issues with the police. Leslie McSpadden's 18-year-old son, Michael, was shot dead by police. He'd been unarmed.
It's over. Ain't no more of this. You know what I'm saying? Either you're going to respect the fact that we're a citizen in this city, and you want to give us the equal rights that you have when you go home to your children. We're not going for it no more. They killed a kid out here.
Once again, we're seeing a scene with African-American protesters facing police in riot gear. These men and women talking about police brutality, the police for the moment standing firm.
He needs to know that that wasn't an animal that he killed. He was my son.
So let's take our first look at a single move that could help solve race problems in America. How about criminal justice reform? Let's call that solution 1. Making sure, for example, that black people don't get longer sentences than whites for the same crime. Or what about solution 2? better police accountability, like making police officers wear body cameras. So far, so predictable though. If we want to move beyond the headlines, we have to accept that racism goes much deeper than that. It's not just about criminal justice or the police. Just ask this woman who I met in Selma, Alabama. She sent her daughter to an until then all-white school, but a couple of weeks later was called to an emergency parents meeting.
A gentleman stood up and he yelled at the board and he said, "You've ruined our heritage. You've allowed this to happen and now you've ruined our heritage." And I was like, oh, that's when I knew, like,
Because Shania was the first
because
black
Shania was
student.
the first black student to be accepted into that school. Kids spray painted in the yard, "Go back home," and they created a website and a Facebook page, and there's graffiti spray painted of a Shania being hung from a tree.
Just a shocking thing to happen in this day and age. But for some people, it's really not just bubbling underneath, as we found out in Montana.
An African American could never be part of my family in the sense that he's not part of this extended family that is a race that have evolved over tens of thousands of years.
They're all part of the American family. You appreciate that?
They're living in this country in a way. In terms of who defined the United States, it was never defined by Africans. It was defined by Anglo-Saxons, by white Europeans.
And take a look at this. This was a place I visited in my very first month of reporting here. Well, as you drive into the town of Harrison in Arkansas, this is the huge sign that you see by the roadside put up by white supremacists. But the sheriff here says he can't do anything about it because of the right to freedom of speech and expression. And white supremacists have certainly been making their voice heard more and more over recent years. But even among the general population, I've found many people who simply have no time for the Black Lives Matter movement.
And this hands up, don't shoot, that has continually made our nation worse and divided our country, not unified it.
So when African Americans say they feel discriminated against by the police, they are killed at a higher proportion than, for example, white people in their interactions with what would you say to those?
I say that's bogus. I say, you know what, maybe you should stop committing crimes.
So maybe unexpectedly, as suggested by Darcy and others, including, you might remember, that pastor we heard from earlier on, comes solution 3. Stop talking about racism. But there's a reason why some people, like the hip-hop artist Talib Kweli, told me their everyday experience means they can't stop talking about racism.
It's a shame that we have to actually say something as simple and basic as that. Black lives matter. White lives matter. Everybody's lives matter. But white parents are not watching their children be shot down by the police in the street. So it needs to be stated.
In some of the protests in the last few days, there were some young African American men who were even burning the Stars and Stripes. Can you understand that feeling?
Whether or not a young black man burns a flag because he doesn't feel a part of the country.
A giant can't cover forever. You gotta get your cheddar wherever.
He's a part of this country, whether he burns a flag or not. And it's that frustration of knowing that you're a part of something that shuts you out and shuts you down and attempts to treat you like you don't exist.
Powerful stuff. And as one teacher told me in Mississippi a couple of years ago, a place with its own race and poverty problems, this is not just something for one group to think about.
I think that in other places, it's easy for rich folks to be over here and poor folks to be over here, and white folks to be over here and black folks to be over here. And here in Mississippi, we are all in this together. Like, we are going to rise and fall as a Mississippi Delta.
So what is the answer for Mississippi and everywhere else, for the one thing that could help solve race problems and that involves all Americans? Our final suggestion comes from one of the most respected civil rights voices in this country.
We have to talk about that narrative of racial difference. But there's a narrative of difference, racial difference, that has been created by centuries of slavery.
And that was his answer. But what does he mean? Actually, something quite simple.
And I think that we can do some very tangible things. We've got monuments and markers all over this town about the Confederacy, about Robert E. Lee, about Jefferson Davis. We have very few that talk about slavery. We have nothing that talks about the terror era.
Monuments, that's his answer. It's going to need some thinking through, but that's our solution for it. Of course, I remembered the conversation with Brian Stevenson when we were recording that report from New Orleans I showed you earlier. Let's see a little bit more. It's about a fight over a few statues, but now it actually feels like it's about something more fundamental.
We know that we come out of a brutal history of kidnapping, slavery, and genocide in this country. We should not be venerating people who participated in that slaughter and that genocide.
General Robert E. Lee was the commander of the Confederate Army, which lost its fight to keep slavery. His statue is now gone.
We reclaim these spaces for the United States of America because we are one nation, not two, indivisible with liberty and justice for all, not some.
So the mayor of New Orleans agrees. Dealing with the issue of monuments could actually have a profound impact. And of the 4 tangible steps forward that we've suggested, this feels like one that deals with the underlying causes of racism. But how? While we were in New Orleans, we spoke to many people fighting for the monuments to stay.
These people were good people. They lived and died for a reason, you know, and why should we just forget it? Why?
For some, it was for the defense of the institution of slavery.
Okay, but they're wrong. What is really the big story here tonight is the youth standing behind us who are convinced that these good people are all neo-Nazis and that we're all racist, and they've been screaming at us all night. And they have no clue about history or anything that's happened. And it's a problem.
So why such opposing views about what should and shouldn't be represented on the streets of New Orleans? Well, it's partly down to the fact that even to this day, there are such different ways of teaching things like the Civil War, of slavery, and segregation in schools in this city.
How much of the slave history did you learn? And when I realized that if you had white teachers, you didn't really learn too much because they didn't want to feel uncomfortable in the class. So if you had black teachers, you learned a lot.
You were constantly told as like a young child, maybe it was like your grandparents or something, the great old glory stories of how it used to be. It kind of comes embedded in you.
In many places in the US, schools can teach Civil War history however they like, not even saying at all that the war was about keeping slavery. So I guess this is really about the broader issue of narrative. When that comes to monuments, it's not just about what is there and needs to be taken down, but what isn't there and should be. Let's take a look at this building that tourists are passing without a second look here in the heart of the historic French Quarter of the city. This was actually the biggest slave market in New Orleans, and yet there's not a single plaque to say that. I spend a lot of time in the South, and there really are so few monuments that mark sites that are related to slavery. And from later history, around 4,000 places where African Americans were hung from trees that go entirely unmarked. So it's about the way Americans think about their country's sometimes shameful past. But why is that important? Let's hear from Brian Stevenson.
You go to Germany now and you are forced to confront the legacy of the Holocaust. It's a country that is determined to reconcile itself with that history. So there's stones and markers and memorials. You're told to go to the concentration camp.
So his point is Germany could only move forward when it was honest about its past, that hasn't happened here. In some senses, it feels like the divisions of the Civil War are somehow still alive, and that feeds into a racist mindset and into the big disparities that still remain. Well, there are many other solutions we could have offered to be that one step America could take to help tackle racism. But the debate around dealing with monuments is one that's gaining momentum. It's not just an issue for the South or just about removing Confederate monuments, but it's about changing a narrative across divided cities all over the country. It's not going to be easy to achieve, though. White supremacists are certainly not happy with the removal of Confederate monuments. This is a protest they held in Virginia. Of course, the real answer is there is no one solution when it comes to racism. many things need to be worked on. And it's certainly a long journey to go from removing statues to preventing this. But it could be a small start in a process that is desperately needed.